This video will provide an overview for Chapter 10, Genres of the New Testament, in our textbook, Introduction to Biblical Interpretation. Here the authors will explore four primary genres found within the New Testament, namely biography, historical narrative, epistles, and apocalyptic prophecy. Let's focus then first on biography, which is exemplified in the Gospels. As the authors discuss the various pros and cons of classifying the Gospels as biography, you'll find them settling on the determination that as theological biographies, the Gospels fit well within the understanding of narrative, or biographies rather, within the ancient world. As they move next to implications for interpretation, a primary question that they wrestle with is the historical trustworthiness of the Gospels. Can we believe them as actually reporting what took place? Along that line, they caution us to be aware of measuring our metrics of historical trustworthiness against modern historiography. So if you picked up a biography of Martin Luther King Jr. or of Lincoln, there would be different expectations for either the clarity or the fidelity, the minute accuracy of information. It would be unfair to expect those same factors to be fully at work with ancient biographies. They had different standards. Also, when the ancients present certain dialogue as if it were a straight quote, keep in mind that they were free to paraphrase. This especially becomes evident as we compare one of the three synoptic Gospels. The synoptic refers to Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And we compare a quoted material with another synoptic Gospel, and we find it doesn't match. This is not evidence that it fails the historicity test, but rather it's evidence that they felt free to paraphrase. They also felt free to telescope events which were separate or elements within an event, blending them together. And again, the textbook deals with examples of this. Finally, we might assume that something that's presenting itself as historical information should necessarily be set up in chronological order. That is an assumption. In other words, the authors, biblical authors, are not required to do that any more than a modern author is required to always present material in chronological order. They may have a different driving scheme, such as a thematic scheme. Gospel of John is famous for not following chronological order in all points. We should pause to talk about tradition criticism briefly. It's described on page 513. The aim of this line of thinking is to examine the material, in this case, gospel material, but it's not limited to gospel material, to examine the material and ask the question, how much of what we hold now in final form, how much of that is actually factual or historical? If you're wondering what else might it be, what's proposed is that some of it could be legend. In other words, there might be a core or a kernel of the information, which was actually what happened, and then people who received that kernel, those core stories, began to tell additional stories that did not happen, that were legend, which then spun around the core, giving us what we have now. That is the line of thinking of tradition criticism. While there can be value derived from critical examination along these rails, as you may detect, it can be carried to an excess. Page 514 in your textbook, again 514, the last paragraph of that section, just ahead of the major heading that reads reading horizontally and vertically. Just ahead of that, notice the conclusions that our authors reach. And these are cautious conclusions that say we do not want to be irresponsible and relegate to legend elements, reports of Jesus that frankly there is no reason to discount them in that fashion. So tradition criticism sometimes goes overboard, and you want to be aware of that. Studies in orality, and this is an authentic field. It involves examining reports and then weighing whether or not they could have come from the original event or were they fictitiously spun out. Orality is saying that before an account was written down, it occurred and then was described orally. Studies in orality lead scholars to conclude that the accounts in the Gospels are highly trustworthy and closely connected to the events that actually happened. We're encouraged as we read the Gospels to compare synoptic parallels. Think of Matthew, Mark, and Luke lined up side by side, and you read them horizontally. That is to say, compare similar episodes or similar pericopes that appear in parallel Gospels. But more importantly, the authors stress the importance of reading vertically. And here, think of the Matthew accounts just spilling down from top to bottom in a vertical fashion. We want to primarily read a passage in the context of Matthew, or if it's a Markan passage, read it in the context of Mark, with the other stories and teachings that Mark included. There's a kind of a shop talk term called kerygma. Kerygma, you'll see it referred to on page 515. This is a Greek word that has the meaning of proclamation or announcing something. The root term, if you're curious, has to do with a trumpet. So trumpeting out information, if we were being very, very woodenly literal. Proclamation is what kerygma involves. And this is a shop talk term in biblical studies that is used to describe information, core information about Jesus and his message as it was transmitted from person to person or from preacher to audience to congregation in the earliest days of the church. There is no single written down distillation of the kerygma from the pen of the gospel writers or from Acts. Rather, we deduce what the kerygma consisted of by looking at some of the most compact statements of who they thought Jesus was and what they understood his mission to be. So we look, for example, at some of Paul's sermons recorded in the book of Acts, or perhaps a theological statement about the nature of Christ and his mission in Paul's letters, or Jesus' statements about himself in the Gospels. We study these and deduce from this what's the core essence of the message about Jesus and the kingdom of God. Another shop talk term in biblical studies is redaction criticism. Find this on page 517. Think of redaction criticism as an effort to examine the stages of editing of a document. What we're thinking of here is the selection process that the writer goes through in determining what he or she will include in a report and what is determined to be ancillary or secondary importance, and consequently, in a sense, it doesn't make the cut, or what's included. Redaction criticism pays attention and tries to get into the mind of the author and say, based on what you decided to include, what are your editorial objectives? In case you You wonder, how can a person ever do that? Think once again of the synoptic gospels with their parallels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. As you watch what Mark includes and what shows up perhaps in Luke that Mark does not include but may well have been familiar with, scholars come to the conclusion that it looks like Mark is presenting the story of Jesus especially so that non-Jewish people would get a clear idea who he is. So, a gospel for the Gentiles. This is the idea of this is the intent of redaction criticism. There are layers of redaction criticism that can be very useful. However, as you might imagine, if we get off to the extremes and speculate too theoretically about what that audience intended for a given composition was, some of those speculations can be skating on really thin ice. So again, we need to be judicious when we read or engage in redaction criticism. Next, the writers take up key theological issues arising from the Gospels, namely the nature of the kingdom of God and the ethics of Jesus. Read over that material. It's useful. In short, one of their main points concerning the kingdom of God is that with the arrival of Jesus and the incarnation in his ministry, the kingdom of God did arrive, but not fully. So that's the meaning of already with the first coming of Christ, but not yet fully arrived, for that will not happen until Jesus' return, the second coming. Read also what they have to say about the ethics of Jesus. That is, what is it that's incumbent on people studying his teaching, incumbent on them to do? They'll describe various viewpoints and interpretations, settling on this, that what Jesus said for people to do is incumbent on those who are his followers. And this is in distinction to some who would say what Jesus said to do is incumbent on all people, whether or not they have signed on to be followers of Jesus. Now we come to subgenres or forms that appear within the Gospels. First, have to do with parables. The writers caution us against adopting an allegorical interpretation. You may recall that when people were using allegorical interpretation as a primary hermeneutic, it meant breaking down components within something such as a parable and assigning individual meanings to each piece. That can be a hazardous way to go. It seems too subjective. What's the alternative? Try to listen to the parable as conveying principally one main truth. One main truth. Think of the parable of the soils in Mark chapter 4. A main truth that comes through that is, if a person has ears to hear, they should listen. That is, they should be receptive to what Jesus has to offer. It can do great benefit, but will be of no benefit if it just bounces off the soil of our souls. Be receptive. And that's a gateway teaching. For unless a person is receptive, no subsequent teachings given by Jesus later in the gospel will be of any benefit. Now, having said that, the authors make a good point from the case of the parable of the prodigal son, and that's the second major bullet here. In that case, we have three characters, and while we won't assign some particular association with each piece, it can be valuable for us to step into the shoes of each character and imagine ourselves and listen to what the message may be for us. If we are, for example, the father, are we in a position to act graciously and solicitous of the well-being of someone who has run away? Or Are there times when we are the brother and we may feel treated unfairly when grace is extended to someone who has misbehaved? If that's the case, then we need to observe what the elder brother, did wrong and not imitate that, but behave more like the father who exclaimed, "This son of mine who was lost has come back," and the joy that he expresses. Or are we ones who have bucked the traces, have thrown those off, and have run away to try things our own way and found we've been burned? It was not satisfied. It did not crack up to be what it was advertised to be, and we come humbly returning. Then the scenario or the character of the prodigal son himself is one that we should identify with, return humbly, and seek Father's mercy instead of presuming that we're beyond help, beyond forgiveness. So there's an example where it would be a mistake to say this parable may have only one meaning. By looking at it through the lens of each of the three major characters, we can derive valuable exhortation or principles that will affect our own discipleship without sliding into a real atomistic or a minute form of allegorical interpretation. Finally, toward the end of the section on parables, please don't miss their warning against domesticating the parables. That is a really important one, because those parables some of them just have teeth in them. They're very prickly, and we run the risk of misinterpreting them, feeling we know what they say too easily, and we're not hearing the shock value or the bite, feeling the bite that the original audience would have heard. Here's another form, miracle stories. Pretty easy to identify which ones qualify for this heading, don't they? When we come to interpreting them within the Gospels, it's important to recognize what they contribute to the global message of the Gospel. Jesus' miracles were principally attesting signs, and some of the Gospels talked about them that way. They're signs, they're indicators validating Jesus' supernatural identity, so that the observers, the followers, the disciples would connect the dots and then come to the $64 million question, who do you say that I am? And they would come up with the right answer, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. The miracles were like signposts pointing to that. What could we interpret wrong? We could interpret wrongly if we look at a healing and simply say only that healing tells me that if he wishes, God can arrest physical deterioration and restore physical life today. It does mean that. That certainly is within God's power. But think of the fact that there were a lot of people sick in Palestine that didn't get healed by Jesus. In other words, if his power to heal was simply an indication of God's benevolence to alleviate suffering, then would you understand if we say it looks like that job didn't get done very well in Jesus' life because there were a lot of people that weren't healed? Now, we celebrate all that were, and yes, God can do that today, but let's keep in mind in terms of working towards a responsible interpretation within the Gospels, the miracles are primarily validating the identity of Jesus. For those of us who approach the Gospels with a presumption of Jesus' deity, because we're very familiar with the story, what we need to do is to get into the skin of the first century audience, the people in Jesus' earshot, people that were watching him. He looked like just a typical Jewish man. The notion that he was divine was the furthest thing from their minds. So that's the first bullet here. The second bullet under miracle stories is that they point to the rescue he brings. So they're acknowledging that the fallen condition of the universe under the curse is not God's intent, nor is it permanent. And so these are a foretaste, the miracles are a foretaste of Jesus' kingdom eventually going to overturn the curse and stop death and all that's associated with that. Finally, pronouncement stories. One more in the collection of forms within the Gospels. Pronouncement stories are our way to describe a particular episode in the Gospels that lead up to a pithy saying. So the example given here, when Jesus called Levi, who is also Matthew, that disciple, when he calls him, summons him, invites him to be a disciple. And you may recall that since Levi was a tax collector, he was despised. And Jesus, he nipped that in the bud, that resentment. And he said, look, I'm not in the business of just getting nice people to come, righteous people. I'm here to call sinners. So absolutely, Matthew qualifies. There's almost a quirk in there, isn't it? Yes, they thought of him clearly as a sinner, since he was Matthew was in league with the Romans, and as you probably are aware, he was authorized by the Romans to tax beyond the standard rate that would be his profit. So he could tax, he could charge exorbitantly and then turn over a portion of those proceeds to the Roman government. And the community around him thought he was a traitor. He was Jewish. He's clearly a sinner. And Jesus said, excellent. That's one of the boxes on my application form for being a disciple that you got to check. And as you all know, Matthew can check that one really well. So he's welcome. Good thing, because if that weren't one of the boxes on the checklist for people eligible to be redeemed, I'd be left out, and I've got a pretty good hunch you would too. This wraps up the Gospels portion of New Testament genres. The next video will proceed in the next portion with historical narrative and Acts.